right, so we'll get started. And to begin, I would like to read our land acknowledgement statement. And so to truthfully acknowledge our site's history and present experiences, it is important to recognize the beginnings of this place. So we take this moment to acknowledge that the history of our site does not start with Europeans. The town of Ridgefield exists on the ancestral homelands of the Ramapo, Munsee Lenape, and Wishquaisgeck people. They were the original stewards of the land on which Keeler Tavern Museum and History Center stands today. We thank them for their strength and their resilience in stewarding this land, and we hope to continue their legacy of protecting this site and its history. All right, and I am Catherine Prescott. I'm the Chief Curator at Keeler Tavern Museum and History Center, and my co-host, as always, is Mary Teltis Ottamanelli, the brand new Executive Director at the Hendrick I Lott House. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And tonight, we are going to be talking about food innovation. And this is a really broad topic. There's a lot of different definitions of innovation and what counts as food innovation. So Mary and I kind of chose just a couple of topics. We sort of tried to limit ourselves to the 19th, early 20th century. Didn't totally work out that way, but we chose it as a starting point. So there's lots of interesting things about food legislation, food storage, all sorts of things. And I discovered a surprising number of French emperors named Napoleon were involved in.
Oh no.
Yeah. So I started with canning as like my first one. And that's where the first Napoleon comes in. Because in 1795, the Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte offered a prize of 12,000 francs for an invention that could preserve food efficiently and effectively for his army. And it took about 15 years before somebody actually won the award, but a chef and brewer named Nicolas Appert from Champagne, the Champagne region of France, won this award. He discovered this method of packing food inside champagne bottles and then sealing it with a mixture of cheese and lime. Lime like the limestone, the mineral, not lime the fruit. So cheese and lime, and then he would cook it in the bottle. Then he realized it's probably easier to do it with wide neck jars to get the food inside rather than a skinny little champagne bottleneck. But this was the beginning of hermetically sealed canning. And unfortunately, the process was still pretty slow because you have to really cook these bottles in water, basically boil them to get them to temperature. So it was slow. And then they didn't have great transport to get all of these glass jars to the army wherever they were. And Napoleon had his armies all over the place. So Napoleon's armies didn't really benefit from it, but other folks kind of took this up, and another Frenchman who'd moved to London kind of took on the project as well, and he developed the tin canning process, so using tin cans, and was able to patent that, and it kind of proceeded from there and kind of cycled. And by the mid-19th century, canned food became a status symbol among the middle class, because it was kind of seen as kind of a frivolous novelty in the middle of the 19th century, at least in England. Of course, the wars, all the various wars throughout the century, increased demand, and then growing urban populations as well, increased demand for canned foods. But there was a lot of danger associated with eating canned foods because the way the tin cans were made, they were soldered with lead alloy, which would then leach the lead into the food, and then you would get lead poisoning, which not great. So it wasn't until was it 1888 that Max Ames of Binghamton, I believe, invented the locking side seam, or the double seam process to make tin cans. And that way the solder stays on the outside. And so he called that his sanitary can. And I did have, let me see, I can share my screen. This is Nicolas Appert. He looks like a character. And this is one of the first bottles that he was using for his canning.
It was definitely interesting. Like I looked this up. I looked up metal packaging in like a general sense of what they look like. How did it evolve? And it was interesting to watch people be like, oh, we have to seal this from the outside. Oh, we have to fix it this way. Oh, lead is the problem. And using different materials and a lot of trial and basis. So when I was looking up the inventors of a lot of these things, it was always like they came from different fields. I think it was, I looked up so many people. There was somebody who invented like the cardboard packaging that we use today. And he came from like a completely different field. And then there was somebody else. There was one inventor who came from like being an eye doctor to going into becoming a jeweler to eventually being like, no, I was the microwave person. Oh my goodness. There were so many people that I looked up. It was, food packaging. I looked up so much food packaging that I went grocery shopping and I went walking up and down the aisles and I was like, I know where this came. Was the inventor of sliced bread. Totally got that one wrong. He grew up in Iowa, pursued a career as a jeweler, decided didn't want to do it anymore, and then left to go work on his brilliant idea of creating a bread slicer. And it's interesting to think about people who are in these left hand like fields and then taking a complete right hand turn and going into another one. And things like sliced breads are things that we use every day. And it's like, it gives me hope because I don't know, I got a little, I don't know what the word would be, but it was kind of like, you know how there's this track of like, you go to school, you get your degree, you get your job. And it was really hopeful to like read about all of these inventors who didn't take the paths that we're kind of like kind of pushed into taking these days in academia, and seeing all of these people coming from different industries being like, no, I have an idea, I want to work on it, and having that imaginary and creative passion to create these things. And I was like, we need more of that. Where did that go? Because that innovative behavior gets like the weird like gastro food that we were kind of talking about before we started the lecture of that, like, but what if we didn't have water bottles and we just had liquid water? And I will skip ahead. One of the more interesting ones that I found was from 2019. Full screen was the edible water bottle. And I was just like, the creativity here is top notch. Because I mentioned to Catherine earlier as well, like you still need something to like put it in, which would be the plastic. But I mean, looking at this, there was the statistics of how much, it was like 50 billion water bottles are used every single year, and they're not recycled, and they're single use, and they just kind of like sit in landfills and they don't degrade. And I understand the creativeness and the innovative thought process behind being like, I can just take one of these things because it's made from an algae mixture that forms a membrane around the ice. Ice melts into liquid water and membrane, which is edible and biodegradable, forming a watertight seal around it. To consume the liquid, you can either bite into the tasteless membrane, or you can sip out the liquid or the entire ball and like not eat the membrane. They don't make this anymore. It was a very like company-esque situation where they tried, it failed, but they rebranded themselves into No Pla, so like no plastic. And now they're doing a bunch of prototypes for different biodegradable food packaging. I saw a laundry detergent on their website. It was things like this that made it really cool to be like, I can't imagine how excited people were for tin packaging or like sliced bread or the things like the microwave that we just have in our everyday life. And I was like, that must have been really cool to be in the 18th and 19th centuries watching like technology grow, the Industrial Revolution grow, and all of these new things are available to you in such a niche, interesting, like who knew that this could happen kind of a thing. And I don't think that we have that anymore. I don't know. I would like to be surprised by like a microwave again. Because that looks pretty cool. I would try it. I don't know if it would, I don't know how many like sips of water. I mean, I've got my big giant Yeti that I carry around with me all day. And that's my edible water bottle, if I may. But yeah. I like the creativity of reading about all of these things that we take for granted. It was really interesting, and hearing the advertisements and like the firsthand accounts of inventing these things and them hitting the shelves and public reaction to it was very interesting.
Yeah, I think that's the thing is there's that phrase, the greatest thing since sliced bread.
Yeah.
But we don't have a new like thing that's greater than sliced bread that we've changed that saying to, right? Sliced bread is still one of those great things. Um, and that definitely was like one of the things that you and I both decided we have to look into sliced bread. Um, which I found fascinating because I didn't realize like why factory sliced bread needed to become a thing. Um, but so when I was researching it, it was like as bread shifted from homemade to factory made, when it comes prepackaged, the only way you could tell, like a consumer could really tell if the bread was fresh, was how soft it was, because stale
Mm-hmm.
bread goes hard. And so once you have soft bread, it becomes a lot harder to do even slices with a knife at home, right?
Yes.
Because you don't have the hard crust kind of holding it up. And so then it became like a thing, people had to figure this out. And so I believe his name is Otto Rowetter. And he was a jeweler you mentioned. And
Mm-hmm.
he invented a number of like bread innovations. But his most famous is obviously the factory bread slicer. But apparently a lot of bakers and bread companies were not interested in trying out his bread machine, his slicer. And so finally he found the Chilcott Baking Company in Chilcott, Missouri. And they were about to go bankrupt. And so they really had like nothing to lose. They were going bankrupt. So if this thing didn't work, they were bankrupt anyway.
Yeah.
So they installed um,
Do you have
the
a
bread
picture of it?
slicer, and I've got a picture here. Um,
It's huge.
found, yeah, this is one, but I found the patent too.
Yeah.
That was one of the things is I looked at a lot of patents this
Yeah.
time, which is really interesting. But this is really complicated. I am not an engineer. I'm mechanically minded. Um, but this is the bread slicer, and it made even slices, and it was so successful that um, the Chilcup Baking Company saw an increase of sales of 2,000%.
Mm-hmm.
And people, factory bread companies decided that they definitely needed this sliced bread. And then Roeder continued to invent things, and he made all sorts of like accessories for his bread slicer. So a packaging machine, like conveyor belts. And here's some
Slicing and
other,
wrapping devices was one
yeah.
of them that I read. Like he
So
like put both of them together.
yeah, here's one. He's a display rack for um selling your bread. And I like at one end, there's a slot for an advertisement. And then also, this is really cool, and I want to figure out how it works, is the sliced bread package. It's like a cardboard package that as you take slices out, it compresses so that your bread is always tightly wrapped in paper or cardboard or something like that, to keep it as fresh as possible. Because one of the problems with pre-sliced bread is more surface area, it goes bad faster. So that was another thing he invented as well. And then of course I went from sliced bread to the most famous thing people do with sliced bread, which is make sandwiches. And so kind of went into the invention of the sandwich. And there's a long told story that the sandwich was named for and supposedly invented by the Earl of Sandwich.
The fourth.
The fourth Earl of Sandwich.
Very important. Very important.
Yeah. In 1762, he was a notorious gambler, and he was on a 24-hour gambling streak, and he couldn't leave the table to eat. And so either he asked the cook to bring him something he could eat without messing with his game, or he like described what he wanted. The stories differ. But basically what he ended up getting was cold sliced meat between two slices of bread. So no utensils were needed. He could eat it with one hand and keep playing cards with the other. And then it became like a thing in England, in gambling halls. All the men wanted, to have what sandwich had. And then this meal became known as the sandwich.
Very simple and legendary. There's some sort of, it's in the Northeast, there's a sandwich company called the Earl of Sandwich that has like a whole page on the history of the sandwich. And I was like, I think you're closer to one than I am. I think they're like outside of Boston and stuff. And I was just like, wow, we really ran with this idea. But like, to preface, like, he did not invent the sandwich. The concept of having, allegedly, I read, I don't know if you saw this, it was salted beef between two pieces of bread. I was like, very specific. We'll go with it. But the concept of a sandwich is not new. I saw also a lot of this in terms of inventing things and like creating things. A lot of these are just things that have been done for thousands of years. I know somebody tried to take credit for the wok, I read, and tried to put a name down, and I was like, no, we're not doing this. A sandwich has been invented for thousands of years. We talked about this with like bread, and like every culture has some sort of like meat in bread situation. It's not a new concept. He trademarked it. He was the first person to trademark it, but he didn't invent it. I don't want to give somebody who had a gambling problem this much credit. But yeah, no, it was interesting to like read the same but different stories over and over and over again about this one little tiny thing. And then I was like, but it worked though, because I immediately, when I was doing this last week, was like, I want a sandwich for lunch. But it worked though. So I'll give him that. But then I was like, I want a good, yeah, it was a whole spiral.
It was interesting though to see how the sandwich in Anglo-American culture like changed throughout, because after 1762, when descriptions of this sandwich are coming around and showing up in literature and travel journals and things like that, it's very specifically like a man's meal, because it was for people in the gambling den, right? And then all of a sudden, like at the end of the 18th century, it became like a genteel thing. You had it at a ball late night, like those little finger sandwiches. And then it became, in the 19th century, it started showing up at taverns and inns because they're easy to make. You can make a bunch of it. You can leave it out, right? You don't need to eat it hot or anything like that. And so it became a thing for travelers, and, you find it at taverns and inns. Maybe the Keeler Tavern served sandwiches, who knows? And it became sort of that working class thing, especially once the railroads hit, right? Because you could sell sandwiches at the railroad station whenever the train showed up. And then I also found, like, once the temperance movement came, taverns and saloons like doubled down on sandwiches. And so they started offering free sandwiches with drinks so that people would come into the tavern to buy drinks.
Nothing good ever comes from the temperance movement. We have to bring it up.
But I did also think, apparently a lot of like the sandwich histories talked about how sandwiches weren't really popular in the US for a long time, like until the middle of the 19th century. And the first reference to a sandwich in American literature wasn't until 1830. So that's like, what, 60 years, 70 years after the Earl of Sandwich gave his name to this meal. And also, sandwiches in the UK tended to be beef, and in the US tended to be ham. So different fillings.
Which is so interesting now, because sandwiches are so mainstream. I mean, you can Google, I was trying to figure out sandwiches in New York City, and if you Google it, it's like hundreds of lists of like top 10 sandwich places and like where to go get sandwiches and like the best sandwich in each of these shops. So it's interesting that it didn't pick up, but now it's just such an important piece. And I know you're going to talk about peanut butter and jelly, which is like everybody's favorite classic thing, which I had for lunch yesterday. But I wonder if there's some sort of JSTOR article that's like, this is why Americans didn't like sandwiches.
Yeah.
I'm curious.
I always wonder if maybe it was like, I mean, was it just it's an English thing and we're Americans, but that doesn't really show up in other parts of American cookery at that time. So we were perfectly happy to take like all the other British cooking for better or for worse. But apparently we just didn't like sandwiches. But I did look, I went to my classic, go to the cookbooks and see, and you wouldn't think that people would like make recipes for write recipes for sandwiches, right?
Oh, they
because
did.
For us today, it seems so kind of common sense, right? Put things between two slices of bread. But this is from an 1832 cookbook, the Cook's Own Book by Mrs. N.K.M. Lee, who styled herself a Boston housekeeper. And so there's 3 sandwich recipes in her book. And the thing I noticed about a lot of early sandwiches is they always talk about doing everything very thin. Like these sandwiches must have been like paper thin. Because it's, here you have your sandwiches for travelers. Spread butter very thinly upon the upper part of a stale loaf of bread, cut very smooth, and then cut off the slice. Now cut off another thin slice, but spread it with butter on the underside. And then take some cold beef or ham, cut it into very minute particles, sprinkle these over the butter, and having added a little mustard, put the slices face to face and press them together. So
you need more than that.
Yeah. Yeah, so we've got a couple of different sandwiches. Sandwiches number 1 has cold roasted or potted meat, served for luncheon. And then number 2 is, I guess, more elegant. And then the cake sandwiches, which is the dessert. Sponge cake a few days old, as for bread sandwiches, and spread strawberry jam or currant jelly over them.
These look delicious.
Yeah.
Like I would probably double the amount of food on them, but they do look delicious.
But then I started looking at, okay, what are like classic American sandwiches? And you get like the po' boy and the chow mein sandwich. But number one is always peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And so I went looking and I found what is supposedly the first recipe for peanut butter and jelly sandwich, the first kind of mention of it. And this is from the Boston Cooking School magazine in 1901. And she says, for under peanuts and pralines in this article, for variety, someday try making little sandwiches or bread fingers of 3 very thin layers of bread and 2 of filling, 1 of peanut paste, whatever brand you prefer, and currant or crabapple jelly for the other. The combination is delicious and, so far as I know, original. So 1901, peanut butter and jelly sandwiches were not really well known in the US. Ooh.
Ooh, it's allergy season, ladies and gentlemen. It's got us all.
Okay. Oh, wow.
Oh no. Cough, put it on mute and cough.
Yeah. So while I get my voice back, I
Oh
thought,
no.
here, we can watch this
Marvin, must you eat peanuts in bed at this hour?
Gee, dear, after 1 or 2 peanuts, I can't help myself.
Here, dear, try this.
What is it?
Silent peanuts. Skippy peanut butter.
But peanut butter's for kids.
Oh, not Skippy, dear. It's made on purpose for grown-ups. Skippy's never sticky or oily. It's always fresh and smooth, and it doesn't taste like peanut butter. It tastes like peanuts.
You sound like a television announcer.
Marvin, that's not nice to say.
You're right, dear. Like the man says, you like peanuts, you like Skippy.
Marvin, why did you do that?
Had to show the jar, didn't we?
I love that that was marketed for adults.
Yeah, so that was the thing, is by the early 1920s, peanut butter had kind of started becoming marketed towards children,
Right.
because the peanut butter and jelly sandwich with, sliced, factory sliced bread, it was becoming a thing that kids could make themselves. And so that was kind of how it became kind of lunchbox staple. But then you had to go back and market to adults again, because it became known, peanut butter became known as a kid's food, right?
Honestly, have you ever toasted a peanut butter and jelly sandwich?
Oh,
It's delicious. But I will say, yes, it is absolutely a child's meal. My 5-year-old makes it with me because there's knives involved, right? Even if it's a butter knife. But yeah, that is like, it was one of my favorite things to like get her to like use her motor skills to make, and it's a safe food for her because she's a little on the pickier side. So yeah, like me and peanut butter and jelly get along really well. And I'm always like testing the waters of like different peanut butters. No crunchy. Does anybody like crunchy peanut butter, or are we a smooth group? I know it's a very hot topic. I've seen people get very angry over their peanut butter choices, but I understand it's a very intimate thing. But I was also looking into the peanut butter and jelly phenomenon, and how it started being marketed towards children from adults. There was something about, it was a part of the US military rations for World War II, because the peanut butter was high protein and shelf stable, and it can be transported over long distances. It could be packed as a lunch, and it was easy to eat for them. And I was like, things that you don't really think about for peanuts, but probably a next season episode, FYI, because we both got really into like the concept of peanut butter. But yeah, like I never really thought about it. And then it's interesting because then I saw an article, and it was one from one of those like weird health blogs. So take it with a grain of salt, of how peanut butter and jelly went from this like really fancy, like loved by Americans food, into being vilified of like, oh, you're a lazy parent because you send your kid to school with peanut butter and jelly. So, I mean, what goes up comes down, will always go back up. And we see that with like canning and farm to table and like that niche concept of how people interact with food. Um, but it was very interesting to me because I was like, I didn't think people saw making peanut butter and jelly as like being a lazy parent thing. And I felt a little shamed for a second. And I was like, no, 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 no. Peanut butter and jelly is delicious. We're not doing this. It is nutritious. You can put it on any kind of bread. You can use high protein peanut butter. You could throw chia seeds on there. They won't know. I just had to put my 2 cents in for that because it made me, I don't, the health food bloggers is the trigger for me, but I digress.
So I know we said peanut butter and peanuts will be its own topic, but I do want to say that our favorite John Harvey Kellogg was credited with inventing modern peanut butter. So you know, health food blogs, it's always tied back to John Harvey Kellogg. So yeah, I had to bring that in.
I saw his name and I was like, we're not doing this month. We're going out without mentioning a Kellogg brother. We can't do it. It's been like every single one this season.
I know. But back to sandwiches. Because there is this debate on whether or not a hot dog is a sandwich. And if anyone has strong feelings about that, you could put it in the chat, because it's something that people have discussed. It is bread around meat.
I'm curious.
And it would, I guess most sandwiches would fall under what the Earl of Sandwich would be able to eat without interrupting his gambling game. So it might qualify that way, right? Depending on what you're putting on top of your hot dog. But I don't think it's a sandwich. Earlier, I got into a lot of legislation. And in 2006, there was a court case about what constitutes a sandwich. So in 2006, a court in Boston, Massachusetts ruled that a sandwich includes at least 2 slices of bread. And under this definition, the court finds that the term sandwich is not commonly understood to include burritos, tacos, and quesadillas, which are typically made with a single tortilla. And this was the case was about a restaurant that sold burritos wanted to go into a shopping mall where there was another restaurant that had a non-compete clause that no other sandwich store could be in the same shopping mall. And so they had to legally say that a burrito is not a sandwich.
What year was this?
2006.
Oh, that's pretty modern.
Yeah, but I did
hot
also
dog
find,
is not a sandwich.
So in the UK and Australia, the term sandwich is even more narrowly defined than in the US. So a sandwich refers to an item that uses sliced bread from a loaf. So if it uses similar fillings, but uses an entire bread roll cut in half, it's generally referred to as a roll. Or if the fillings are hot, it can be called a burger.
Okay.
So there's very kind of strict rules in the UK and Australia about what constitutes a sandwich.
What's the Connecticut word? We say hero, like a sub.
I don't know. We've got a couple of different ones. I think sub.
Because now we're getting into very technical, like sub, hero, hoagie.
Yeah. Grinder.
Like that.
I think we use grinder. Yeah. Some places grinder.
No one's responded, which means nobody thinks that the hot dog conversation is very important, but the hot dog is not a sandwich. The burrito is obviously not a sandwich. I love the fact that somebody went to court over this to have it fully defined, which will only benefit us because we were also asking the same questions. But my goodness.
I know. My personal definition is it's all about orientation. So a sandwich, the bread has to be on the bottom and the top. So if you turn the hot dog sideways, then it's a sandwich. That's just my personal definition of a sandwich, which nobody else, I've not come across.
But how do you turn the hot dog to the side? Because it has to have all like the toppings and stuff. Doesn't it fall out? Like that's the point of like a hot dog and like a taco
I
is
mean,
having
you
it
could
upright.
put the fillings on the side. I don't know.
Okay.
That's just my definition. It's if the bread has to be on the bottom and the top.
All right. Catherine has spoken. Oh my goodness. Food innovation. Catherine looked up hot dogs and sandwiches, and I looked up microwaves.
Yeah. Which could take
I
us to our next topic.
the microwave.
The microwave. Well, I looked up frozen food and TV
Yeah.
dinners and went into that. So that is related to the microwave.
The microwave I thought was very interesting when I was looking it up because we think of it as, again, like I mentioned earlier, these things that are just in our houses that we have that like can warm things up, and it's like, I don't want to say pocket size, but it's counter size, right? Like most houses come standard that it's built in somewhere. I will preface that I have not owned a microwave in over 6 years. Um, I've learned to live without them. I do slightly miss them sometimes, but I'm okay without them. Um, they were originally invented in 1945. Percy Spencer leaves the military and he has all of this information, and he's self-taught again, right? So it's those people who are self-taught, who are learning things, who are like, I have ideas and we're going to follow through with them. And the innovation that I think we're missing today. He has all of this information about short range military radar, magnetron, a bunch of science terms that I didn't fully understand while I was reading this. Um, I'm not going to lie to everybody. There was a lot of big words that I could not define or pronounce. But he had this idea of using the radio waves that he learned about during the war to heat up food, and using that technology. So there was one quote in 1858 I found in a Reader's Digest, about how he could quickly heat up food with his new invention. And it was one day a dozen years ago. This was from 1958. Spencer was visiting a lab where magnetrons, the power tubes of radar sets, were being tested. Suddenly, he felt a peanut bar start to cook in his pocket. Other scientists had noticed this phenomenon, but Spencer itched to know more about it. He sent a boy out for a package of popcorn, where he had, when he held it near a magnetron, popcorn exploded all over the lab. And the next morning, he brought in a kettle, cut a hole in the side, and put an uncooked egg in its shell into the pot. And then he moved a magnetron against the hole, and the whole thing turned into juice. A skeptical engineer peeked over the top of the pot just in time to catch the face full of egg cooked in his face. And the reason is that the yolk cooked faster than the outside, causing the egg to burst. Again, science terms that I don't fully understand that how the microwave works today, but it was interesting to read the fact that like one technology that worked for a lot of the World War II stuff, which I think was a similar pattern in a lot of the late 20th century innovations that we saw, was like, hey, we have all of these skills, how can we apply it? Or this industry already exists and we're producing these materials, how can we make it for regular everyday consumers? The original point of the microwave was to have it on like airplanes or restaurants and stuff. I have a photo of like a really early one. They are much larger than you think they're going to be. So the one on the left is like one of the original prototypes of a microwave. So they were meant to go on airplanes and restaurants to like quickly heat up food for customers. And then it slowly shifted into being part of like an everyday home essential, which is when I was originally thinking about food innovation. And I was like, well, what's in my house that's really interesting? It was like a microwave. It was like a stand mixer, a juicer, a dehydrator, things like that that we use on an everyday basis. And seeing how large they were, and then even towards the 1960s, sorry, the 1970s, I'm so 1800s. Seeing how small they get, seeing as how fast that technology rapidly updated itself to get from the left side to the right side to home consumer usage is, I mean, science crazy. We'll just say that. But it was very interesting to see this concept of like, why did this popcorn go? And I don't have it on here, I don't think, but the original patent, and I looked up a lot of patents like Catherine did, was literally with popcorn. It has like a piece of corn on it and how it explodes using the magnetrons and stuff. That Spencer found in that like first experiment when he was like onto something about using it for food. Yeah, I the one on the right also just looks terrifying. I but yeah, you looked a lot into the food part of it, and I looked into like, well, what goes into it, like the food packaging and the microwave and all of those things to get to that point, which I thought was a good balance of information.
Yeah, so I looked up the frozen food and TV dinners, because back when we did Immigrant Foodways back in January, it was, I found a lot of like, for these immigrant women who are trying to balance maintaining traditional cuisine from their home country with like really wanting to take advantage of the variety of new kind of foods that they were, you know, being exposed to in the United States. And one of those things was frozen food and TV dinners, especially in the middle part of the 20th century. And so I really wanted to like figure that out. So frozen food and TV dinners kind of predates microwaves just a little bit. But they really take off once microwaves, you know, become household items. So frozen food has always existed in places where it gets cold enough to freeze your food. But kind of the quick freezing method that is used today for most packaged frozen food that you find in the grocery store was invented by Clarence Birdseye. And he was in 1912 to 1917, he was up in Labrador, Canada. It gets very cold there. He owned like a fox breeding ranch, which I believe for fur. He's breeding foxes for fur, but he discovered the Inuit practice of immediately freezing fish as soon as it was caught, when they go out fishing. And for much of the year in Labrador, you pull the fish out of the water and it basically freezes itself. But he discovered that the Inuit would had this practice and they would store it outside in the cold, and that when it was thawed out, even months later, it still tasted really good. And so he started experimenting and trying to figure out how you could use this kind of method, because there was commercial freezing, but it was basically just putting stuff in a freezer. And it wasn't very popular because when you unfroze your food, it was really watery and there was no taste and it was kind of mushy and gross and nobody wanted it. So Birdseye discovered that if you flash freeze something, freeze it really quick, the ice crystals that form are really small and they don't actually rupture the cell membranes, because that's what happens when you slow freeze something, is these big ice crystals form. And so he developed two methods. Both require pre-packaging your food before you freeze it. And where's my, excuse me.
Birdseye is still in existence, right? That's
Yes.
still like that's still a big company.
Yeah, the company. I think they're mostly do frozen vegetables. One of the things is he was known for his frozen peas, because they were like really still vibrant green. But he originally started with fish. So once he came back from Canada, he actually worked for a lobbying group for commercial fishermen. And he learned that a lot of fish actually spoiled before it ever made it to the store. So this freezing method would help with that. So here's the patent for Birdseye's freezing machine, and it basically holds packaged food under pressure as it's chilled to minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit through the evaporation of ammonia. And using this machine, he could freeze a 2-inch thick package of meat in about 90 minutes, and fruit and vegetables took about 30 minutes to freeze this way. And this is basically a similar process to what happens in modern frozen food manufacturing. And through this process, he created 168 patents just for the flash frozen food method. That's techniques, packaging, paper types, the tools needed, all of that. So 168 patents. But it still took a little bit of time to catch on. It wasn't until World War II that frozen food really caught on commercially, because there was a shortage of tin, so canned foods was in short supply. But also women were in the workforce because the men were off at war, and so they were looking for ways that they could make meals quicker, rather than having to cook a whole meal from scratch after coming home from work, right? And it also, frozen foods spurred a demand for home refrigerators, jumping from less than 10% before the war to over 50% of households having a refrigerator after the war. And then from there, it cycled on to the TV dinner, which is a version of frozen food. And the first kind of frozen dinner was developed by Maxon Food Systems to sell to military and airlines in 1945. And here you can see in this picture from the New York Times, it's called a strato plate, is what he called them. And you would heat them up in his specially designed oven called the Whirlwind. And there was the New Yorker ran a profile on Maxon, which I just think their description of him was really funny. They said he has been a grandfather for 5 months, closely resembles Henry VIII, and is left-handed. Of all things to describe this man. And
it's so weird. That's what airplane food looks like now.
Yeah,
like that hasn't changed, even how they warm it up.
Basically, yeah. Unfortunately, the Maxon strato plates never went to retail market because he died shortly after. But Maxon apparently, he was really into frozen food. He grew a surplus of cauliflower one year and learned he could freeze it, and then it still tasted good a year later. And so he then, for the rest of his life, never touched fresh food at home, except for an occasional salad. And when he had dinner guests over, he would take them into his freezer and allow them to pick out what they felt like eating. So that he was quoted as saying, "None of this nonsense of everybody at the table eating the same thing." But unfortunately, Maxon he died before his frozen dinners could go out to market. And there were a couple of other frozen dinner companies that kind of popped up, but they never really caught on until the Swanson Company. And they had a huge, massive marketing campaign for their TV dinners, and they coined the term TV dinner. And they advertised on television and in paper, in print media and everything like that. And in their first full year, 1954, first full year of selling TV dinners, they sold 10 million trays, which is insane. That's an insane number.
Insane.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Was that what they normally looked like? I don't know if you know the answer to this, but when they launched it, was it primarily just that kind of meal that you have on the screen?
So Swanson's, their first meal was turkey. So what happened was Swanson Company sold frozen food, And they had 260 tons of frozen turkey left over after Thanksgiving, 1953. And it was on these refrigerated train cars, but refrigerated train cars didn't work unless the train was moving. And so Swanson's was having this train go back and forth between like Nebraska and Tennessee or something like that with all of this turkey. And the story is there's a couple of different people within the company who are credited with designing this TV dinner. But one of the stories is Jerry Thomas was a salesman. He came up with the idea of pairing the frozen turkey with other holiday staples, like sweet potato mash and green beans and stuffing, and having it in a partitioned aluminum tray that could be heated in the oven. And then later on, they developed a tray that could be heated up in the microwave, which made it even faster. It went from 25 minutes in the oven to a few minutes in the microwave.
Wow.
So yeah, I thought that was actually fascinating. And the way people, especially women, really latched onto these new innovations. And I think, the women had the buying power to kind of direct these, and make these innovations catch on.
I saw that with the Tupperware, like the rise of Tupperware and women having this new ability to both use it, and that was like the Wonder Bowl that had the supreme suction on it and stuff. But also being able to sell it directly in Tupperware parties and having that ability to not only use the product, but be able to be a marketer, be a seller, be part of the economy in that way, in the way that they had been in World War II, and kind of getting back some of their autonomy. And their VP of marketing was this woman. It's in my Barnes and Noble cart. There's a book that looks so fascinating on the VP. I forgot her name. I wrote it down. Of the Brown Wise, creator of Tupperware parties. So Brown Wise. She is the one who, like, in my opinion, kind of pushes Tupperware into being like a really cool way to store food, into the concept of like, I have Tupperware in my house today. I'm sure you do too. There's some sort of like plastic packaging that you have to keep your food, and the rise of Tupperware parties, and then the fall of it as well. So I will be reading that over. It looked very interesting, but I completely even forgot about Tupperware parties. But it was interesting to read up on the fact of like how it maintained itself, what gave it such a stronghold. And a lot of it was because they got to use fun colors, and they got to bring like rainbow colors, and you can color coordinate your dishes to your Tupperware, and they would come in different shapes and sizes. And just the way that it was marketed was really, really smart. I mean, like it had that like vacuum seal. There's a photo I have, I will show you, showing you how strong the Tupperware was. So you have Brownie Weiss here throwing it in the air just to show how suctioned the Tupperware was and how safe and secure it was at a Tupperware party. And she's got all of these on the table and stuff. Like, that's just so incredible to me. But I vividly remember having a bunch of like blue ones in my house growing up. And I think that's why I have blue ones in my house today too. But it was interesting to see that connection of engine, like innovation of, we have this like plastic Tupperware and it's really cool, but also here's how it's impacting different other parts of everyday lives, of being able to sell it and being able to customize it. And oh yeah, you can throw it in the air, but we can do like 4 other things that directly impact your life. And then it led me to that newest purchase that I made, which is literally a Tupperware for extra pizza slices. So we've come a very long way. It is a 10 out of 10. It's a very niche product, but instead of having to like stack your pizza slices when you're done with them and they get soggy, you just put them on top of each other in the Tupperware and it holds and it keeps them good. I'm just saying, we're having the conversation. You were allowed to talk about hot dogs. I can talk about how to store cold pizza. I'm just saying. Well, it's only fair.
The thing about Tupperware is you never have the size that you need.
No, never the right one. Or something is cracked. Yeah.
And you never have the top that fits the bottom.
I think that's part of their marketing ploy. So you can just buy more. You
Yeah.
see, it's still continuing.
All right, we've got just a few more minutes. Thank you all for joining us tonight. And if you have any comments, your favorite innovation that you've experienced, something like that, you can put it in the chat. And in our last few minutes, I always like to try to find something hyper local to Ridgefield, where the Keeler Tavern is. So since I was in the patent directory, I decided to see if there were any food related patents from Ridgefield inventors. And I did find a couple that were interesting. So the first one, the oldest one, is this one in the center, E.G. Hoyt cider press, which
cool.
he had an improvement on a way to move the apple mash through the press that required less energy than the standard kind of lever presses of the day. And he used this conveyor belt system. And then on the left, you have a device for cutting, weighing, and measuring butter, patented by L.H. Davis in 1897 here in Ridgefield. And I tried to read the description and it did not make much sense to me. But in the center, what's marked like 12, 13, 11, 12, 13, that's the scale part where it weighs the butter. And then at the bottom is like a big, essentially a cookie press that you like stick into the block of butter. So we didn't get to, I also looked at margarine in my research, and by this time margarine was available in the United States. And I did notice that in his description, he says that this is a device for cutting, weighing, and measuring butter, lard, and similar substances, which I assume to mean margarine as well. So that was an interesting one. And then this last one on the right-hand side, patented in 1917 or 1918 by D. Chidlow, is a process and a machine for making bread. And this is related to whole wheat bread, because for a long time, the process of making whole wheat bread was to basically soak your wheat until it germinated. But if you know how wheat is, it's got that papery bran around the outside, the chaff, and the old system left that papery outside part of the wheat kernels in the bread, and it has no nutritious value and tends to irritate the bowels as it passes through the system. And so this new process and machine for making bread is a way to get rid of all of that papery bran after your bread, your whole wheat has germinated. So you can still make your whole wheat bread without any of the things that are going to make your tummy hurt. So these were kind of three of the food related inventions from Ridgefield, which I thought were interesting. Yeah, it's always nice to kind of bring it to hyper local, because there's always something.
I had a lot of fun looking on the patent website too.
Yeah. Yeah. The patents are really interesting. I also found this article about using patents to teach history in the classroom.
Mhm.
We actually do have a school program, an outreach program where we talk about inventions and patents here in Ridgefield, which is a lot of fun to do with kids. Um,
Very cool.
so uh, we are at 7:30, so I would like to thank everyone for joining us tonight and for joining us all season. This is our 4th season of doing taproom tastings, and we are excited. We will be back again in the fall is the plan, probably November, December. So keep an eye out on both the Keeler Tavern Museum website and the Lott House website. We'll keep you updated on that. As always, I will be sending the recording of this video of tonight's talk to everyone who signed up, and it will be posted on our YouTube channel as well. So I hope everyone has a wonderful evening, a great summer. And if you've got any ideas about topics you'd like us to talk about in future taproom tastings, feel free to reach out to either Mary or myself, and let us know what you're interested in. We can always, there's never a shortage of ideas, but it's always nice to know what people are interested in hearing about as well. So
Don't let us get too off topic.
yeah, 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 you have to keep us on track sometimes. So again, enjoy your evening and thanks for joining us.